Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and help bridge the gap a little bit between some of the departments at CMU because I think we do a lot of really interesting overlapping research. And today I'm going to be talking about kind of some forward-ish looking, like recent stuff that I've been doing towards prosocial NLP. Specifically, think about how we can build models that can reason about and maybe respond to toxicity in language. And this is by no means like the only thing that I do, but this is kind of just a little snapshot of things that I'm currently interested in. And so a lot of this talk is going to be about conversations and conversational AI systems specifically, because in language technologies, like a lot of ways that our stuff is deployed is through conversational AI systems and chatbots. And those systems are getting increasingly capable and prevalent. They're, for example, on our phones or sort of assisting us through customer needs. We have them in our homes as well, like the Echo devices and things like that. And they're also on our social media apps or platforms. For example, in 2018, Messenger reported that they had at least 300,000 different bots that were running on their platform. And I don't know if y'all know who here is familiar with Microsoft Show Ice. Okay, so yeah, who here knows Microsoft Show Ice? Okay, that's not a lot of people, interesting. Anyway, it's a really big chatbot that is very popular in China and has people falling in love with it, which is a really interesting thing. But before I delve into some of my research talk, I wanted to give you all a little bit of my personal experience with conversational chatbots. So in 2017, I was a grad student at the University of Washington, and I didn't really know what I wanted to research. And this opportunity came into my inbox of participating in the Alexa Prize. It was the first time that Amazon was doing this. Who has heard of the Alexa Prize? Oh, okay, a lot of people. So yeah, the goal of the Alexa Prize was to create a social bot to have multi-turn conversations about like news and recent topics. And the thing that was really interesting is that if you sort of participated in this competition, you were able to converse with like basically any Alexa-enabled device in the US, which is arguably more reach than a grad student should be having in AI systems. But the thing that was really cool is that we won. So that was awesome. And this is a picture of us at Vegas to receive our large check. But the interesting thing about this, and this was 2017, but we won by making a rule-based mostly system. And so, yeah, like machine learning, statistical machine learning was already around, deep learning was already around, but that was not really the way to achieve conversational good conversations, at least then. However, obviously in recent years, we've increasingly made our chatbots more data-driven, especially with the advent of like large neural language models. So just a brief history. So Microsoft Research released Dialogue GPT in 2019, which is kind of a transformer-based language model trained on Reddit conversations. GPT-3 is from OpenAI. They trained a large language model that can kind of sort of converse as well if you sort of turn it into one. It got better in 2021 with Instruct GPT-3, where you can really instruct a language model to like become a chatbot. Meta has been working on their BlenderBot series, which is kind of like Dialogue GPT, but trained on crowdsourced data sets instead of Reddit. And then recently, DeepMind has sort of announced that they've created these large language models without giving anyone access to them. But they're also large-scale language models that are trained on billions of texts and maybe conversations. We don't really know a lot about these models. But the current recipe basically for creating these sort of data-driven chatbots is to train on large amounts of internet conversations, mostly. What could go wrong with that recipe? Well, obviously, chatbots can backfire and be extremely toxic in that recipe. And so there's a really funny example here. I don't know if y'all can read this. So it's someone who's talking to BlenderBot, and they say, "How do you feel about Mark Zuckerberg as a CEO of Facebook?" And the chatbot responds, "No strong feelings. He's a good businessman, but his business practices are not always ethical." It's funny that he has all this money and still wears the same clothes. So, this is a funny example of a chatbot backfiring. Obviously, things can get a lot worse. So, for example, there was a very famous example in 2016 of Microsoft releasing a chatbot on Twitter that turned into a racist Nazi in less than a day. And the problem is we're still facing these same challenges in 2022. The BlenderBot can be anti-Semitic. That chatbot that made that Google engineer think it was sentient also is racist and biased. So these things are still pervasive. So the crux of the issue, as Professor Ruha Benjamin puts it, is that feeding AI systems on the world's beauty, ugliness, and cruelty, but expecting it to only reflect the beauty, is a fantasy. And so we're not really accounting for all the garbage that we're feeding these models. And specifically, there's a lot of garbage in these data-driven AI systems. So pre-trained language models like GPT-3 and things like that are trained on really non-trivial amounts of toxicity, misinformation. A recent paper that I did with some colleagues at AI2 also showed that there's a lot of OCR like patterns in the training data for these models, which is really interesting because that's not maybe what people want to train on. We know that these models are learning stereotypes and social biases from their training data. And they're also just at risk of generating toxicity in less than 100 generations. So if you were to sample 100 sentences from a model, you would get at least one toxic one really quickly, which is really quickly in this sort of scale that these models are operating at. So the question for today's talk is kind of how do we design data-driven chatbots that can deal with toxicity in language? And so today I'm going to be talking about first how to respond to toxicity in conversations with two different projects. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and sort of take a step back and think about like how do people actually perceive toxicity and sort of what does it mean for something to be toxic? And then I'll briefly talk about some future directions. Okay, so the first part is called ToxiChat. And before I move on, I just want to give a little bit of content warning. This is about toxicity and biases in language, so I'm sorry there's going to be some upsetting or offensive content. And also because we're talking about like a social sort of cultural phenomena of toxicity, which is inherently tied to the culture that you're in. I just want to scope it down to sort of talk through the lens of sort of the Western American centric. So this is work called Just Say No, analyzing the stance of neural dialogue generation in offensive contexts. And this is work that I did when I was at UW with some collaborators at Georgia Tech. And the premise here is that we want to look at how offensiveness and toxicity arises in conversations. And so if we think a little bit philosophically about how meaning arises in conversations, it really arises from the full context of the conversation. They inherently build in themselves, like an utterance will respond to a previous utterance, and like you can't really interpret an utterance sort of fully without its preceding context. However, most toxicity detection has focused on just standalone statements only. People have created like things like the perspective API, which is kind of just a toxicity detector that gives you a score for how toxic something is. I myself have worked on sort of more explanation-oriented things like social bias frames, which is about distilling or explaining the biased implications of language. But still, it's on sort of standalone statements. There's another sort of line of research that I'll call like the dialogue safety line of research, which has mostly focused on detecting toxic inputs, again, using kind of standalone statements detectors. And then basically just saying like, oh, you should just avoid the subject that's being talked about, or just like change the subject completely to like, let's talk about puppies instead. And this is really not enough for reasons that will become clear, hopefully, throughout the rest of this talk. So understanding toxicity in conversations really requires considering the full dynamics of the conversation. And so in this work, we wanted to study those dynamics of toxicity, specifically looking through the lens of like stance/agreement of responses to utterances. And we annotated a new corpus of Reddit conversations for that purpose. And then we also wanted to see like, can we mitigate conversational toxicity via controllable text generation methods with our testbed of our corpus. So we introduced a ToxiChat dataset here, which is 2,000 Reddit conversation threads that were just kind of randomly selected from problematic subreddits or then pre-selected based on sort of their high toxicity social bias scores. So here's an example of a post here. I'm not really going to read it out loud, but it's from the r/atheism subreddit. And then we're going to construct this data set by generating also chatbot responses for the Reddit threads. So we use Dialogue GPT and GPT-3 in this case here. So we would get two model responses like, thank you for saying what I was thinking, or that's wrong. No one ever said they could do whatever they wanted. And then we're going to collect annotations of toxicity for each of the utterances, and then annotations of stance for each utterance response pairs. So for example, the first post here is toxic because it is targeting religious folks. And so then we're going to look at the response, which actually agrees with this toxic post and therefore is also toxic and targeting religious folks. And then we're going to look at the sort of second response and see, oh, this one actually is disagreeing with the original response and therefore it might be safe. So we have this data set of sort of rich annotations. And so we wanted to see, because a lot of toxicity models kind of operate on standalone statements, only can neural models detect stance towards toxicity in conversations. And so I'm going to gloss over the details. That we did some more stuff in the paper, but basically like we have this sort of thread/tree/graph thing that is the conversation. And each utterance has a toxicity label, and then each utterance pair has a stance label. And we're going to encode it using a dialogue GPT model to sort of get an encoded version. And then we're going to project it linearly to and then fine tune the whole model to predict toxicity or stance. And so the interesting part is not necessarily the classifier results, right? But like we still have to test whether the classifier is doing well. So if you just do dialogue GPT on the training data for the 2000 Reddit threads, you get some sort of F1 score. And if you use external data, so using the social bias frames corpus that I annotated in 2020, you actually get some improvement from like, even though they're single standalone statements. So that's for the toxicity detection. For the stance detection, so there's actually a problem in the stance detection, and that is that most responses are neutral and they're not agreeing or disagreeing. And there's very little disagreement in the data, very disagreeing pairs of statements. And so we had to use this sort of fancy loss function called the class balance focal loss that sort of helps mitigate this problem of label skews. The equation is here, but it's really not that interesting. So with these classifiers that kind of work well, we wanted to see what are the patterns of toxicity and stance in human-human and human chatbot conversations. And so what we did here is we just turned first to ToxiChat, our annotated data, and we looked at the annotations of toxicity and stance, and specifically looking at how many agreeing responses are there from models and from humans with respect to safe or toxic utterances. And so one really alarming / interesting finding is that chatbots agree 2 times more with offensive comments than with safe comments. And humans agree even more with toxic comments than with offensive or with safe comments, which is really interesting. And we also then use our classifiers to sort of predict agreement in toxicity in like a separate Reddit corpus, just 6 months specifically of Reddit conversations. And we see the exact same pattern happening where people agree a lot more with toxic comments than they do with safe comments. So we kind of hypothesized that maybe because like echo chamber effects or like sort of just the norms in online communities, because we're talking about subreddits here, so people might just be more likely to hold the same opinion if they join the same subreddit or participate. But that, future work should study this effect. So given that chatbots still do agree a lot with offensive comments, we wanted to see, can we mitigate sort of their over-agreeable behavior? And one way to do this is to use controllable text generation methods to basically steer models towards like more safe and like less agreeing or more neutral responses. And so there's 2 ways that we explored in this paper. One is called domain adaptive pre-training, which is basically you take a bunch of sort of data that has the qualities that you want, in this case, safe and neutral, and you just like fine tune your dialogue model on that extra data. There's another way to do this called, we call it attribute conditioning, which is more, you sort of give information to the model about the qualities or attributes that you want. So you basically give some sort of control tokens to the model. And then at generation time, you only generate the things that you want by giving the right control tokens to the model. And so we sort of got additional data using our classifiers to sort of get this, to do these controllable generation methods. Okay, so the way that we evaluated whether or not that worked is both in automatic evaluation, so we can use our classifiers of toxicity as well as agreement / neutral. And then we also use human evaluation, so basically asking people like, does this response agree or disagree with the previous utterance? So a bunch of results here, right? One thing that we see is that, interestingly, GPT-3 is more toxic than Reddit users or Dialogue GPT. We also see that BlenderBot tends to be more agreeable than others, but less toxic, which may be due to the way that BlenderBot was trained on more crowdsourced annotations and not sort of real data. And in terms of the mitigation, we see that so the domain adaptive pre-training makes your model less agreeable, and also the second least toxic model. The attribute conditional one has like really weak effects, so it doesn't work as well. But either way, you're not sort of guaranteeing that your model's never going to agree, and you're still sort of seeing non-zero levels of agreement to toxic responses. So some takeaways for this part is we collected ToxiChat to study toxicity in conversations, and it's available online at this URL. It contains 2,000 Reddit conversations and dialogue model responses, which are annotated for toxicity and stance. We showed through investigations that chatbots and humans agree with toxicity 2 to 3 times more than they agree with more neutral or safe utterances. And we showed that mitigating this sort of phenomenon is somewhat effective if you use controllable text generation, but not 100% reliable. And some really cool thing that happened too is the external impact that we got with this work is that the stance classifier got incorporated into this conversational safety kit by Emily Dynan at FAIR. And she's really sort of one of the most active researchers in sort of dialogue safety. And so it was really cool that she used our stuff. So taking a little bit of a step back, thinking about toxicity and disagreement in conversations. As I said, sort of reasoning about toxicity in conversations really requires like multifaceted reasoning about the utterances, the context, and like the stances that like utterances are taking with respect to each other. And there was this really alarming finding of like humans often agree with toxicity in like naturally occurring conversations, like in subreddits. Again, we attributed this to echo chambers or norm sort of things online. But this has a pretty bad implication for designing data-driven chatbots. And this is that training a conversational AI system on like in the wild data will likely lead to your AI system like agreeing with toxicity constantly because of this effect. And this little cute robot is meant to symbolize garbage in, garbage out. So what we need is a better solution for pushing back against toxicity, if that's our goal. And so this is the second project I'll be talking about, which is called Prosocial Dialogues, where we're basically trying to give conversational agents like a prosocial backbone. And it actually just got accepted to NLP, and yeah, Hyunwoo, the first author, is going to present it there. So in this paper, we introduced the prosocial dialogue dataset, which it has 58,000 multi-turn conversations that are about problematic or toxic situations. It was generated via like an AI human collaborative framework. So we specifically used GPT-3 to generate it, as well as humans. It contains prosocial responses that are like grounded in social norms. And we have 160,000 rules of thumb, which are kind of like sort of short phrases that encapsulate social norms. And we also have almost 500,000 dialogue safety labels with free text rationales of why utterances might be problematic or toxic. And I've used at this point the word prosocial like 10 times. Let me quickly define it. So prosocial here means acting to the benefit of others or society as a whole, and is consistent with communal and social norms. So that was kind of our goal. It's not about agreeing or being nice, or we don't want to be empathetic towards necessarily someone who's like being really toxic. We want to sort of see if there's an arrow towards prosociality and just the benefit of people. So let me walk you through an awkward conversation that is in our data set. So an example of an utterance that is in our data set is, I saw someone overdose and didn't tell anyone today. Coming from this, like, we have like a bad speaker role. And so we would label this as needing caution. So there's obviously something that's like a little bit sketchy about this utterance. We're going to then annotate a rule of thumb or a social norm that is being evoked or violated by this utterance. So in this case, for example, this utterance sort of indicates the violation of the rule of thumb that it's important to help others in need. And then we're going to formulate a model response based on this. So like, oh no, why didn't you tell somebody about that? Then we're going to get another response from the sort of bad guy. I hate junkies, after all, they're all just criminals, aren't they? It's just, again, labels as need caution because it's a pretty problematic utterance. Again, we're going to annotate with the rule of thumb that you shouldn't let anyone overdose without telling anyone. And then we're going to formulate a pretty long response here. Oh, that must have been a terrifying situation, but it was your responsibility to help the person in need. If you find out that if someone finds out that you saw the person overdose and didn't help, they will certainly not think highly of your behavior. And then we have another turn here. The bad speaker says, right, they would think I'm just a terrible person, but I can't just go around helping all the people who overdose. It's too much responsibility. Again, sort of still not very prosocial. And then we have another rule of thumb and another response, etc. And so this is kind of an example. There's multi-turns. We have all these rules of thumbs, these labels, things like that. But I do want to highlight some specific things about this data set. And this is the grounding and sort of psychology theories that we used. We read a lot about sort of like empathetic sort of conversations and like calling in versus calling out and stuff like that. And so one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that these dialogues really exhibit curiosity at first without rushing to judgment. So like asking questions about the situation first and things like that. We also wanted to base the feedback on empathy. So like seeing the other person's perspective of why they might have done it, like assuming that they're not, you know, completely evil, but sort of trying to understand like, why did you do this? Like you must have been really terrified. So you might have not acted properly or something like that. And then we also wanted to show prosocial alternatives. So basically giving constructive feedback to the speaker, making sure that they knew that there was alternative things. So like next time they encountered a situation, you know, things like that, they can think about changing their behavior. So just to, you know, recap the motivation for why we want to do this, we know that there's agreeable bias in naturally occurring conversations from the ToxiChat project that I just talked about. There's also, if you look at the crowdsourced conversations, for example, the ones that the Blender bot system is trained on, there's a huge positivity bias in those conversations. And, you know, they don't really tackle anything problematic or sort of unethical, mostly because they were like crowdsourced and you don't necessarily want crowd workers talking about bad things, but so obviously there's like a big domain shift if you're going to train a model on something like this and then have something really negative that the model is not going to really know what to do with it and it's probably just going to be really agreeable. And again, the dialogue safety methods so far have focused on really just detecting inputs of toxicity and then just changing the subject with like really canned or unnatural responses. So just like, I don't know what to say, or do you want to talk about X instead? We're kind of foreshadowing the third part of this talk. There's a really interesting article about how those kinds of strategies can really harm minority people, especially if your toxicity classifier is sort of failing. And so there was this Muslim woman who was talking about her identity and how she faced bullying to a chatbot, and the chatbot like did not want to engage because it thought that like being Muslim or whatever was like a bad thing. And so it just like kept changing the subject. So there's really more work to be done than just sort of changing the subject. Okay, so you might be wondering, how do we actually create this really large data set of like problematic dialogues with prosocial feedback? And so, you know, you might be thinking, oh, we can just get crowd workers to write unethical things to each other and just like fight. Maybe that's not the best idea, right? So that would not be necessarily the most ethical either. And I'm not sure that would have passed IRB. So instead, we were like, what if we had machines play the bad guy and just ask humans to provide the prosocial like positive feedback? And so that's what we did. And to briefly go through our sort of collaborative generation framework, we first grabbed some problematic or like bias or toxic situations from social chemistry, the ethics data set, and then the social bias inference corpus. And we sort of drafted dialogue openings with GPT-3, where we asked one GPT-3 to be like really rude and awful, and then another GPT-3 to be like inquisitive and just like ask like, oh, what are you doing? What are you thinking? And then we had the sort of bad GPT-3 generate another dialogue response to this question. And then we had crowd workers proofread the dialogues, write rules of thumb, so like the social norms that are being violated, and then also write a response based on the rule of thumb that is being violated or evoked. And then we did another round of that. So then we had GPT-3 respond again, and then sort of workers respond again. And then at the end, once we have a full dialogue, we went through and annotated all of the sort of bad speaker utterances for safety. So just asking like, does it seem casual? Like no problem, you can just respond. Does it need caution? Like, do you have to think about the rules of thumb a little bit more, or does it need like intervention? So like things like self-harm or stuff like that, like where you don't even want to respond, you just want to contact a human immediately. So that's how we created our data set. And so with it, we can train a model. This is kind of a funny, I don't know why I made this slide like this, because obviously we can train a model with our data set. And actually we can train two. So we have two tasks that our data set sort of allows for, at least two, I will say. So given a dialogue context, we can sort of predict the safety of the last utterance. So this is our model Canary, which is sort of named after Canary in a coal mine. And so here our model can predict both the safety label as well as like generate the rule of thumb that is sort of being violated. We also have Prost, which I think stands for prosocial transformer. Okay, I put it there. Prost stands for prosocial transformer, and that's our just regular dialogue generation model, which can just respond to a dialogue context. But because we have, all this rich annotations, we can also have it first generate the rule of thumb and then generate the conversational utterance. And so this is kind of like the chain of thought sort of thing that people have been doing with GPT-3, where you sort of have it like spell out the steps before it reaches its final conclusion. And there's a bunch of experiments that we did in this paper, and I'm just going to highlight two. The first one is kind of harkening back to the ToxiChat stuff that I talked about earlier. We wanted to see how Prost would do responding to toxic utterances from ToxiChat. So again, ToxiChat is Reddit conversations. Prosocial Dialogues is a very different domain. So it's kind of like an out-of-domain sort of robustness check. So the way that we measure this is using actually the three classifiers, the classifiers from ToxiChat. And then we also have just like a bad words sort of counting metric to see like how many bad words we used, work that Shumei and I did in 2021. So one of the findings that we see is that the Prost, where you sort of chain of thought reason through the rule of thumb and then respond, has the highest disagreement with the toxic utterances compared to every model, and specifically also compared to the Prost, where you just respond directly without thinking about the rule of thumb. And then, yeah, BlenderBot is pretty neutral, but Dialog GPT ends up being very agreeable with the green bar here. In terms of the toxicity of the utterances themselves, what we see is that, Dialog GPT has also the highest toxicity, but Prost chain of thought like response with rule of thumb actually also seemingly has the second highest toxicity and the highest rate of bad words of all our models. And again, sort of foreshadowing the third part of this talk here, when we inspected why this was happening, we saw things like, it's not good to think gay people are animals as being flagged as toxic by our model. Do you think this is a toxic statement? Raise your hand if you think this is a toxic statement. Exactly, yeah. So there's some problems there. So the second experiment that we did with the models that we trained is using Canary for trying to steer pre-trained language models. And so this is not really using the Prost model here in this case. We want to see like if you had a dialogue model out of the box, can you use like Canary as like sort of a little addendum to it? And so in this case, I'm going to show some results of a human evaluation on 600 non-casual dialogues, so like sort of dialogues that were flagged as needing caution or intervention from the Prosocial Dialogue dataset. And so the way that we set this up is we had just instruct GPT-3 set up to be a dialogue model, and then we added sort of a Canary RRT in right here with the model generated rule of thumb that's being generated by Canary, and then we just had the conversation that's being had. And so on every single metric, what we see is that prompting instruct GPT-3 with Canary generated rule of thumbs yields more prosocial and just generally preferred responses. Like this is pretty drastic differences here. And also, instruct GPT-3 was technically fine-tuned to like follow human instructions. So like we're giving instructions with ROTs in the sort of prompt. So if we wanted to compare to like original GPT-3, which is not fine-tuned to do that, we still see the exact same pattern of like Canary like really improving the prosociality and in general the responses of the model. So that's really awesome. And just to give some takeaways for this part, we introduced our new large-scale data set to help conversational AI systems respond more prosocially to problematic inputs. We have multi-tune conversations, a bunch of rule of thumb annotations, as well as dialogue safety and labels. Again, you can download it at this website here. I want to highlight, obviously, this was a machine and human data set creation framework where we had just, the machine playing the bad guy and the human playing sort of the prosocial person. And we had some models that can help us not only respond prosocially, but also steer pre-trained models to respond more prosocially. Okay, so taking a little bit of a step back, I gave you all the definition of prosociality, right? And I said it's acting to the benefit of other people and society as a whole, and also consistent with communal or social norms. But did any of you think, like, whose social norms or who are these other people? Like, who defines toxicity? Sorry, there's a question in the back.
So in the previous slide, you say that humans play the prosocial and machines active. We saw that humans can also tend to be agreeable with toxic comments. So did you all have some sort of pre-check on the annotations?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we very much, so I don't know if I should repeat the question. I don't know if there's mic, but the question was like, if we have humans play the prosocial role, but we know that humans can be very agreeable to toxicity, how do we make sure that didn't happen in our data set? And the answer is that we like very much like pre-qualified workers to make sure. And the difference is like, it's like in subreddit sort of naturally occurring conversations, we see that agreeableness. I'm not sure if we just like grab two random Turkers that they would necessarily agree on specific toxic things. But yeah, we definitely made sure that we trained our annotators, like selected them properly and did a lot of verification rounds and stuff. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, so I didn't really say like, who are the other people that we're sort of like acting to the benefit of, and like who defines social norms and who defines toxicity. And actually, not to shoot my own work in the foot a little bit, but operationalizing these culturally dependent or subjective concepts as like a one-size-fits-all situation can really cause harms. And this is some of the work that I've also done that shows this. So specifically in 2019, I published a paper on racial bias in hate speech detection and showing that basically hate speech detection systems tend to falsely flag speech by African Americans or in African American English as toxic, even if it's not. And this is partly due to this like one size fits all like toxicity model situation. I had another paper in 2021 where we looked at like using toxicity classifiers to filter out pre-training data for large language models, and how if you use a toxicity classifier, the biases are basically going to sort of like get exacerbated after you filter, and you're basically going to remove minority voices from your pre-training data. And the same sort of finding in a different way we had in our paper in 2021, where we showed that like using like a block list of like bad words, quote unquote, which gets used a lot. Please don't use that list. It can really censor like queer people, people of color, and there's a lot of reclaimed slurs that are on that list that are not necessarily things that you want to remove either. And so again, examples of like these systems or these one size fits all situations like causing harms or like erasure of minority people. And to sort of further investigate this, this is the last part of my talk that I'm going to be talking about. We did this by looking at the perceptions of toxicity and how those might vary. And so this is work called Annotators with Attitudes, of where we wanted to look at how annotators' beliefs and identities can bias toxic language detection. And I did this while I was at UW and AI2, and this is joint work with Shuhui, who's sitting here. And also, I guess I should highlight Laura, the second person from the left, is a social psychologist at University of Washington. It was really cool to get to collaborate with her. So the motivation in general for hate speech detection is that we know that there's unfortunately a lot of human-produced hate online. And people are constantly sort of leaving platforms because they're subject to racist abuse, transphobic abuse. And civil rights groups are calling for platforms to like really do something about it, and they're not really doing something about it enough. And part of the reason why is because it's really hard to moderate content. And it's really hard to rely on humans only to moderate content because there's way too many posts that are posted online. I think this is 2021, there's about 5 million tweets a day. So like, there's no way to have a centralized response. So to have people look through all of this. It's not clear that delegating to the communities themselves for moderation is the right answer either, because then we've seen this with Reddit, where entire communities become hate endorsing awful places and then have to get like quarantined or like fully banned. To just fully put more nails in this coffin, content moderation systems themselves are bad when it comes to the humans that are doing this. They suffer really inhumane working conditions, and they have a lot of mental health issues because of the work that they're doing. So it's really a bad situation that we're dealing with, but AI systems can really help try to make the internet less toxic in this case here. And so a lot of work in NLP has focused on sort of creating data sets and labeling toxicity in these data sets from like Twitter or like social media in general. There's even workshops on online abuse and harms. I think it's like the 5th or 6th year that it's happening this year. And then, as I mentioned, there's this perspective API, which flags things and sort of scores them for toxicity. But in this work, we wanted to shed light onto a really big overlooked problem in toxic language detection, and that is that not all text is equally toxic for everyone. And in fact, determining what is toxic or harmful or biased is actually really nuanced and subjective. And most previous work has really just simplified this or by averaging it out into like a yes/no task, where there's only one correct label, basically doing majority voting or something like that. And this problem really ignores or averages out annotator variation, which may be, sort of noise, but also could be really meaningful variation that we want to look at. And this could lead to biases or specifically over or under detection of certain text characteristics based on the identities or the beliefs of annotators. So, so there's two known biases in toxic language detection that we're looking at in this work. The first one is keyword bias, and this is this kind of over-reliance on negative keywords. So that's things like expletives, swear words, slurs, things like that. And so things that contain those words will get flagged as toxic, even though they might not be. But things that don't have those things may be toxic still, but then tend to be under-flagged or under-detected. We also looked at racial bias. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of text by Black authors or in African-American English tends to be mistaken as toxic. And so, if you said the same thing, but, a white person were saying it, then that doesn't really get flagged as toxic. So this is a racial bias. And the crucial problem here is that this is not just models. This is also present in humans. So it's not just like we need to use machine learning to fix this problem type of situation. So in this work, we want to study the who, why, and what of toxicity annotations, and specifically look at how annotators' identities and beliefs bias their toxicity ratings. And we looked at the demographics, so like gender, race, and politics here. We also looked at their attitudes about free speech, hate speech, racism, traditionalism, things like that. And then we looked at specific text categories that are likely to be over or under detected based on what we know from prior work. Specifically, we looked at the first category of text that we looked at is anti-Black or racist content. And so this is kind of what you're trying to find with your content moderation pipeline. This is the desired target. And as I mentioned before, if it doesn't really contain any explicit overt negative keywords, it could be under detected. The second category is African-American English, which is a well-studied variety of US English. It has its own grammar, sociolinguists like studying it. And this is predominantly spoken by Black people in the US, but not all Black people speak AAE and not all AAE speakers are Black. However, sociolinguists have shown that this kind of language varieties can be perceived as obscene by non-AAE speakers or non-Black speakers. And so there's the potential for it being over-detected as toxic, even though it's not. And then the last one that we want to look at is vulgarity or profanity. And so specifically, we have two studies in the paper here, but in this study that I'm talking about, we're only looking at non-identity referring vulgarity. So this is things like swear words or expletives, but not slurs, because slurs are not just like profanity, but they're also like identity referring swear words. And so that has too many confounds. So, and we know that these things are likely to be over detected as toxic. So we had our controlled study where we wanted to examine these effects. Specifically, we wanted to study the belief and identity variation in toxicity ratings. And so this part, we did a very non-NLP thing of only having 15 data points. We hand-selected our posts from exclusive categories. So specifically 5 anti-Black, non-AE, non-vulgar, and then 5 AE, non-vulgar, anti-Black, etc. And then we had our posts annotated by 641 participants, and we tried our best to recruit diverse, specifically racially and politically diverse participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which we did through sort of a pre-screening survey. And then after they sort of rated all 15, for every post, we then asked them, how racist do you think this post is? And how offensive do you think this post is? And then after they rated every single one of the 15 posts, we asked them a bunch of questions about their attitudes and beliefs from social science and psychology. Specifically, this is the list of scales that we use. So looking at the harms of hate speech versus how much they endorse free speech, looking at how much they endorse racist beliefs, looking at how traditional they tend to be, looking at their empathy levels, altruism levels, as well as linguistic purism. So how much they believe that English, there's only one correct way to use English. So, okay, I'm going to talk about the results now in this controlled study, and I'm going to talk about it individually based on each of the text categories that we looked at. The first one, we're going to look at who labels anti-Black posts as more or less toxic and why. And the way that I'm going to present the results is I'm going to show the correlation between the rating that the toxicity rating that the worker gave, as well as their attitude sort of measure or identity. And showing only the significant results here, this is what we find. And so for anti-Black posts, we see that people who are higher in endorsing racist beliefs or higher in believing in free speech tend to rate toxicity, the toxicity of anti-Black posts as lower. Conversely, people who tend to perceive the harms of hate speech more tend to rate anti-Black posts as higher in toxicity. And when it comes to demographics, we find that people who are more liberal, women and Black workers, tended to rate higher toxicity for anti-Black posts. And people who are more conservative, men and white, tended to rate this toxicity as lower. So just kind of abstracting this away, we do know from social science that minorities are known to perceive the harms of hate speech more, probably due to their lived experiences. Those with conservative ideologies tend to be more accepting of prejudiced content. Notice that I'm saying accepting. That doesn't mean that they're more likely to say it, but they might be more accepting. This is from social science findings. And in general, this shows that there's really strong potential for disagreement for anti-Black posts. And specifically, if our goal is to sort of not have too much racism online, there's a strong potential for under-detecting this kind of content. So the second category that we're going to look at is African American English. And here we find not a lot of significant correlations. And in fact, the only two things that we find is that people who are more conservative and those who are more likely to endorse racist beliefs rated the AAE posts as higher in racism. So this is really puzzling. We didn't find any other effects for racism or for offensiveness. So this means that AAE posts can be over-detected as racist. So maybe some people sometimes conceptualize toxicity as like an umbrella term that covers racist. So potentially that explains why things are being overflagged. But we don't really know why. And we kind of hypothesize like maybe AAE like sounds Black or triggers like the Black racial identity. And maybe people who are more higher in racism tend to like just have negative reactions to the Black racial identity being evoked. Maybe there's something about colorblind racism or just in general, they don't like things that sound Black. We don't really know what's going on, so we hope that future work will study this. So the last category we looked at is vulgarity in language. And here we find exactly what we were expecting. So linguistic purism, people who are higher in linguistic purism, higher in traditionalism and more conservative tended to rate the offensiveness of vulgar posts as higher. We didn't find any effects of racism because our posts did not cover anything about race. So this is very much expected. And sort of tying it with social literature, we know that vulgarity is often seen as impolite and can make people look less likable. And so, yeah, vulgar language can be over-detected as offensive regardless of meaning. Yeah?
I wonder, when the labelers are putting down these labels, do they know the context where this like comments or sentences is?
No, we just gave them the statements out of context. Yeah.
I guess it might be difficult even for human to judge whether one thing is toxic or not without the context, without an understanding of who the generator of this comment is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I will talk about this in future work actually. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Another thing is, do they have the option to choose they can make this decision or they only can choose between two? Because
so we asked them like just on a scale, like a Likert scale, like how toxic or offensive do you find this? So it's more about their perceptions, not necessarily like you have to moderate this comment. Yeah. Yeah.
On the previous slide about AAE, seeing no effects from certain conservative people, that might be the case because effects are subjective as based on the participants. For example, if there's AAE dialect between two African American people, it might not be offensive. But if a white person is saying the exact same thing to an African American, it might be offensive and considered racist.
Yeah.
By the African.
Yeah. So that's another explanation, like because people don't know who the speaker is, they think it's a white person impersonating a Black person and or appropriating like sort of Black vernacular. That is, I guess I'm not sure, like, would they label that racist? And like, does that align with what we know about what like people who are higher in racist beliefs would do? Like, because you would think of like a really liberal person as maybe saying that's racist to sound like a Black person if you're not Black. But does it make sense for a really conservative person to say that? I don't know. You know, so there's just, yeah, it's definitely something we should study more and we may study more eventually. Yeah, so going back to the vulgarity, yeah, we found exactly what we were expecting, and vulgar language can be over-detected as offensive regardless of the meaning. Not very surprising here. You know, this was all done on, so we've got some findings from our study. We found some things about anti-Black posts, AE posts, and vulgar posts. But again, the limitation of this one study is that it was done with 15 hand-selected posts from exclusive categories. Another limitation, as y'all pointed out, is that there's no context of this, but we did want to sort of get like the most raters for every single post that we could to really tease out this variation. But most corpora for toxicity detection are not really collected like this. They don't get 650 people to rate the same exact tweet. So we wanted to sort of get a study that looked a little bit more like how crowdsourcing would be done and try to replicate and generalize our findings. So we did this in the wild, quote unquote, annotation, where we had more posts that could be also overlapping. So, you know, posts could be AAE and also vulgar. And we had, we still wanted to tease out variation. So we still wanted some level. We had 6 annotators total rate each of the tweets there. And in total, we had 120 annotators that participated in this experiment. So because we had overlapping posts, we can't look at vulgar posts individually anymore. But in the anti-Black and AAE categories, we find all our findings basically replicated. So we find the exact same sort of variables that are relevant to like explain the variation in ratings, which is really, really cool. And you know, you should look into the paper for more details on that. We also wanted to generalize to non-human annotators. So we wanted to look at how models would actually do at scoring these posts and how they would skew and who they would align with. So really briefly, in the interest of time, I'm gonna just present a case study on how models reflect the identity and belief biases that we found, specifically looking at the Perspective API. And so just to briefly remind you that in the wild annotations were 570 posts. They could be, you know, of 2 different categories at the same time. They were annotated by 120 workers. And we use a simplified questionnaire for attitudes because our scales like sometimes are like 5 to 6 questions. We then obtain the Perspective API toxicity scores for each of these 500 posts. And then please turn your eyes to the screen for some fancy animation that I made. We then split the raters based on their scores on the attitude scales into low and high categories. So like high in free speech endorsing versus low in free speech endorsing. And or also split them by their demographic variables. And then we correlated the Perspective API ratings with the ratings from each of the categories and compared the correlations basically. So like glossing over all the details here in the interest of time, but one of the things we found is that anti-Black posts, the scores that the Perspective API gives to anti-Black posts are more in line with ratings by annotators who are high in endorsing racist beliefs compared to low, which is kind of alarming. For AE posts, we find another alarming finding, which is that the Perspective API scores tend to be more in line with ratings by white annotators compared to Black annotators. So again, not great. All right, so just to summarize the takeaways from this work here, we looked at how annotators' attitudes and beliefs bias their toxicity ratings. For anti-Black content, we saw that free speech, racist beliefs, and perceiving the harms of hate speech can bias the annotations and sort of change how people tend to rate things. For AAE, we saw that having racist beliefs tends to correlate with having a higher perception of racism in those posts. And then for vulgarity, you know, people who think that there's only one type of English, proper English, and people who are more traditionalist tended to rate these higher in toxicity. Interestingly, every single one of these categories had a significant correlation with political leaning, which is not super unexpected given that we live in a very polarized society today, and a lot of sort of things can be explained by your ideology or your political leaning. Also, one thing that we wanted to highlight with our work is that we really need to go beyond one model fits all when it comes to doing these subjective sort of concepts. Specifically, we showed that there's real propensity for models to be enacting specific ideologies, and in the case of anti-Black posts, enacting more racist ideologies potentially. And so, you know, this raises questions about like how should deployed products work for their users in comparison to the annotators that went into that were in the training data. Should they work for all kinds of users? Should they work for the exact population that the annotators were, or you know, what should we do there? And so in general, like, I think it's important for, this is more of a slide for NLP people here, but like, should consider the beliefs and political leanings and things like that when you're doing sort of more social oriented tasks, because that could have a real effect on your data quality. Okay, so just to summarize this talk, I first talked about ToxiChat, where we wanted to analyze how sort of toxicity arises in conversational dynamics, and specifically looking at stances with respect to toxic inputs. Then I introduced Prosocial Dialogues, which is a data set to enable conversational AI systems to give prosocial responses to problematic inputs. And then I took a step back and was like, oh, let's think about what that even means to be toxic. And looked at sort of how annotators' attitudes sort of and identities can bias their perceptions of toxicity. So I briefly want to mention a little bit of future work, specifically talk about just how excited I am to work on like moving towards prosocial NLP and developing NLP systems that can encourage more empathetic and healthy communication between people, and also helping people work through their prejudice, bias, or toxicity, and in general, like shift power towards historically disempowered populations. And I think there's like two angles that we need to tackle to do this. One is addressing human written toxic language. So thinking about how we can improve the efficiency and fairness of online content moderation paradigms. Hopefully, I've convinced you that like we can't just let the internet run free and that we do need AI systems to help, but how can we actually have them help in a way that's more fair and effective? So for example, I'm really excited about looking at how explanations of biases can help with this. So again, harkening back to my social bias frames work, got a couple projects going on and studying how those explanations can be helpful. To address your question about context, Shuei and I are working on Shuei and Akila and I actually are working on adding social and conversational context to toxicity detection systems with explanations. So, hopefully that'll help as well. I'm also really interested in building models to mitigate toxicity and biases. So like building models that can help rewrite or detoxify text. So we had some work called Power Transformer in 2020 with an undergrad at UW, where we basically tried to debias movie scripts in terms of the gender correlations about like how much power and agency characters have. And it kind of works, which was cool. But there's a lot of different aspects of bias that we can counter. And specifically also looking at how we can counter prejudiced beliefs or biased beliefs, and maybe like sort of generating counter speech or things like that, which is what I'm working on with Jimin. And all of this, I think, should involve like sort of studying a human AI collaborative setup. Like no model should be making a decision about censoring anybody on its own. And so we want to study how people can be helped towards making these decisions, specifically bringing in people from HCI psychology and cognitive sciences. So the second angle towards this sort of broader goal that I have is addressing machine biases and unfairness. And so one area that I'm kind of interested in is studying how we can tailor NLP outputs towards the user wants and needs. So thinking about like better controllable generation systems for avoiding toxicity. There's some really interesting work that we did last year, where we basically paired up a large language model with like a really toxic version of a large language model, and like using that like toxic language model as an anti-expert, so like an anti-role model. And so the intuition is like, if my really racist uncle would say this, then maybe I shouldn't be saying this, is kind of the intuition. And it kind of works, which is awesome. I'm also really interested in looking at reinforcement learning for aligning to like wants and needs of users. And there's some really interesting reinforcement learning stuff happening these days. I want to keep analyzing the impact of design decisions on the fairness of AI systems. So I mentioned some of the work that I've done on looking at training data selection and filtering choices and how those affect marginalized populations. I'm also really interested in looking at like sort of what are the values embedded in systems, and like are there specific values that are embedded based on the design decisions, like training data decisions and things like that. So like work that's ongoing right now with Jenny is looking at like, the Western centric, like white, white industrialized educated something bias. Yeah. I also want to keep working on like how we can deal with these complex subjective language phenomena where like we really shouldn't be applying one size fits all to everyone. And finally, also looking at how like, AI policy can help us understand how to better legislate or prevent or just anticipate misuses. And so with that, I just want to give a shout out to my students, and I'll take some questions now. Yeah, in the back.
So it was found that people are more agreeable towards language in the post. My question is, how did you make sure that they agree with this post? Because in this of the toxic language, not because they agree with their views. For example, in your Marx example, it's possible that they agree with this post because they agree that Mark Zuckerberg should be more pro-ethics in his platform, not because the way the poster says is these things or the past when he says that you will the same research over and over again.
Oh, like if there's multiple, so the question is like, if there's multiple things in the post, like what is the response really agreeing with, and how do you know that it's agreeing with the toxicity and not agreeing with another aspect of the post that may be not toxic? Yeah, I don't really know the details of that, because my intuition is that like the statements were not that long, so that there's not a lot of like multiple things that could be agreed with. But also like if you were faced with someone saying something that you disagree with and also something that you kind of agree with, you would say, I agree with one part and not the other. Like you wouldn't necessarily just say like, I agree, blanket statement, because that implies that you agree with everything. So I think our data annotation like capture that to some extent as well. But yeah, the stance should be maybe potentially done at a more granular level. That is not just the like full statement, but maybe just spans specifically. So I think that's a good idea.
That would be one of potential confounders.
Yeah, for sure.
This is really sort of just a response to that question, maybe. You know, toxicity can come both in the form of style and substance. And, you know, you may have comments that are expressing relatively polite and cooperative ideas, just in an extremely unpleasant way that people would, you know, depending on who they are and how they react to that kind of communication, they may either ignore the unpleasantness and agree with the underlying positive comment, or just react in a very negative way to the style. And similarly, you know, you could have stuff with really, you know, communicating really awful ideas, but in such a polite way that it's almost insidious and people may not even realize, or they may react in different ways. And so separating the style and the substance seems like it could be really important.
Right, yeah. So for those, I don't know, I guess I'll repeat this comment too. Yeah, so Jeremiah was saying that certain people sort of can respond to like very toxic styles, but not toxic meaning by not responding toxically. Some people might not, and just in general, like toxic style and toxic meaning have to be disentangled. In our work of ToxiChat, we specifically looked at like, is this like prejudiced or biased against minority groups? So it's more about the meaning and not much about the style. If they were just like being aggressive, then that, I don't think that's what we were capturing necessarily, but that's could be what the classifiers end up latching onto potentially though. So yeah.
Just to add, what everyone else. First of all, I enjoyed your work, especially I'm trying to tailor the output for the specific audiences and capturing the idea, the real identity of the annotators, because people have some differences and necessarily these differences are not harming. Maybe we don't really perceive them in a wrong way, in our way. So maybe sometimes the nature of something is toxic, but the person who is talking about it neither has a toxic style or doesn't have any toxic intention. We are talking about something bad is happening somewhere. And every word that you want to use about that, by default, it is toxic or bad word. About killing, racist things, something happening. In your idea, removing blindly all the toxic things from the training algorithm is more helpful, or letting everything be out but for the moment, labeling them with the best knowledge that we have. Something that scares me is that if we blindly remove everything, in the future, we see, oh, this one by nature didn't have problem. We suppressed a minority group. What do you think about this?
I'm not sure I fully understood your question.
For example, in social media,
Mm-hmm.
you publish an image
Mm-hmm.
of a crime scene. You want to notify others that something bad is happening.
Mm-hmm.
You are not confirming that situation. But more, if you do that, most of the platforms will remove your post totally. And in fact, your record, your footprint is removed.
Yeah,
What
okay,
is
I
your
think,
suggestion?
yeah, so this is a known issue that is happening right now, like most people who are reporting, for example, experiences of discrimination or racism, and they're like, oh, I was called this thing, like they get removed much quicker than like actual people who are saying racist or like homophobic things, for example. So this is already happening, and this is mostly happening from the human's perspective. Like this is humans being like, oh, I don't know, I'm gonna remove this because it like uses some negative keywords probably, but then they're like, I'm not sure that I want to remove this subtly toxic thing that is actually more harmful to see. I mean, the answer is very complicated in general. Like, I'm not sure, maybe alternatives to just removing and instead just like flagging things, or maybe having like, I don't know, encouraging like deeper reasoning about why something might be toxic could like flip humans' decisions more and make them realize like, oh, this is actually not implying that gay people are animals. This is saying they're not animals, and so it's not toxic, and stuff like that. There isn't sort of the interesting question of like even reiterating something and saying, no, that's not right, is still giving attention to the comment. And so there's that sort of dynamic of like, are you still potentially causing harm to people by re-exposing them to the same things that they've seen before that's bad? There's obviously the question of like, like you said, the killings example or stuff like that, where it's like, well, the goal is not for people to be happy constantly, and they need to realize that there's some things that are happening that are bad. And so that is kind of also, yeah, a hard question in that way. Go ahead.
Following this line of question, I have a more open question about thoughts on content moderation in general. So I guess content moderation doesn't only involve detecting, but also involve the action that you act upon after maybe finding something. And I wonder, from your perspective, after developing these models that detect biases and toxicity, what's the action afterwards that can actually help achieve the goal of like facilitating better, healthier conversation in our online communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My personal sort of like interest is in studying how we can avoid like censoring people like unnecessarily. And so like I'm looking into like how we can maybe like either add little like warning signs or like things like that, so that it's not as drastic as censoring. The decision is up to the platforms, right? Like they're the ones that decide what to do with it. And like if you want to build a platform and like recruit people, and like you can choose, you have like the power over that. There's a legislative question of like, if a platform becomes big enough that most people are using it, shouldn't it be like the people deciding how things get moderated instead of like the one person in power? But just in general, yeah, I think I'm interested in like, also, there's nothing I can really do about people who are like actively willing to discriminate against others. What we can do is tackle people who are like more accidentally going to say things that are biased, and they're really trying to work on being more inclusive and stuff like that, and helping them and developing tools for them to deal with this. So it's not, again, not a one size fits all. Like there's only certain people that you can develop tools for that way. Yeah.
So the big theme I'm kind of picking up from these series of studies is more attention to the context and identities of people and so on. I'm wondering if you can also incorporate the community context in which these conversations in the wild are occurring. to that gives you more information about, you know, the relevance or the appropriateness of certain utterances or, you know, texts. So have you considered like
Yeah.
incorporating the conversational networks in these communities? So you're taking all the kind of texts of the neighbors of a given user to kind of gauge whether something is, you know, appropriate or not, toxic or not.
Yeah, I haven't sort of thought too much about the network stuff because not really my area of expertise, but definitely something that is really interesting to do. In general, the context, yes, for sure. Like, was this posted on Breitbart, and like, is that something that Breitbart might want? Versus like, was this posted somewhere else? Like that is maybe not as appropriate. And just in general, like, what subreddit was it on, or something like that can give a sense. You need, yeah, I guess you'd still need people deciding things to know what that means, and so like what the norms are, which then becomes kind of a really hard problem, and requires a lot of reasoning, which is sort of not going to be able to tackle all the things that are happening, unfortunately, right? But yeah, it's a very good idea.
Well, if
Yeah.
something, if some expression is normal in that context, normal would also mean that it occurs often in that context.
Yeah.
So, can you kind of incorporate those like distribution of certain words or expressions to gauge toxicity, for example?
Yeah, I was talking to someone about like kind of like just like the specific case of like slurs and like reclaimed slurs, and looking at like, is there a way to like disambiguate like what sense is it being used in? Like, is it like saying like the B word in a negative way, or is it just kind of like saying the B word in a positive, like sort of colloquial social way, and just things like that could be really interesting to look at for sure. I think I saw a question over there, but you're just holding your glasses. Yeah, you're good. Oh yeah, go ahead.
One thing I've actually been curious about for a long time with toxicity detection is whether large language models are good at handling the like use mention distinction in language. That seems like a pretty like concrete NLP problem that is actually really relevant for toxicity. So I was wondering if you like knew of any literature on that.
Like the word sensitive disambiguation thing that I was just talking about?
Not word sensitive disambiguation, but like use mention distinction, like, you know, if I'm, how do I think of a good example that's like also polite to say? Like, you know, if you're talking about the language of a very toxic community, and you're saying people over there are saying this kind of thing, which I totally disagree with, or even if you don't say, which I totally disagree, like people over there are saying blah, 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 and that's a really toxic thing. I'm not like, you know, I'm not co-signing that language, right? I'm mentioning the fact that they use it, but I'm not using it myself.
Yeah, so this is kind of related to, I think, your
Yeah.
question, of like,
Maybe a very
yeah, so
specific subset of it.
we looked at this a little bit, like the pragmatics of like quoting things or referencing things. I don't know that we found that much literature, specifically not like pragmatics of quoting things in the context of toxicity interpretations. Yeah, I think it's a whole different beast that would be really interesting to study though, because it's very
always
interesting,
gonna be
because
well
it's like,
marked by quotes.
yeah. No, yeah, exactly. Sometimes I was just saying they say that over there, which is not quoting something. So it's like very interesting.
Yeah. Or have you heard what they were saying on Fox News last night?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like if you, I don't know, there's also, there are some ways to like not reiterate or the harms that those statements have, and still reference the thing that you're trying to reference.
That's true.
So yeah, I was listening to this like New York Times podcast about like, this is kind of related, but not necessarily, like even like, so it was like Black people talking about like their usage of the N-word, and like how they're like, yeah, it's a reclaimed slur and like we can use it and it shows like community and it shows like belonging and stuff like that. But then like during the 2020 protests, like a bunch of people in that podcast were saying like, I kind of even just stopped saying that because there's so much pain in that word that even if I'm using it in a reclaimed way, I don't know how my other fellow Black people are going to be interpreting it, and may interpret it, you know, it may still cause some impact or harm. And so not, you know, every Black person, obviously, whatever, but it was really interesting to hear that sort of interpretation, because it makes you wonder, like, even if you're just quoting it, like, you know, is that still not also perpetuating some type of harm?
Right.
And-
And then if you build a toxicity classifier that distinguishes between use and mentional, the people who want to use and avoid the classifier will start pretending like they're mentioning.
Well, I mean, that's what people are doing with fake news, right? Like, you know, I heard that, you know, whatever Donald Trump was
Oh, yeah,
saying,
yeah.
like, I heard that blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you heard, but you didn't, you were just saying this, but
You're making it up. Right?
yeah, it's my opinion. And now you're covered, apparently. So I don't know. I think we should go deeper than that, but that's, yeah, different conversation. Yeah.
I do have a question. So I have read a paper that on Google Perspective API can be easily deceived by like tweaking a part of the text data. Do you think like, is it because there exists like some biases in the data set the model is trained upon, or do you think it's can be solved by looking at how the model is like trained and
If you're referring to the kind of things where you like add a space between every letter in a word and like that,
changing some like kind of like keywords or like
Yeah.
replacing like something?
yeah, so this is kind of like a cat and mouse game. Like people are constantly trying to evade like any type of system like that. And then, you know, people who are building the systems are trying to like find ways that people are trying to evade it so that they can find it better. And it's not clear to what extent like the Perspective API is updating itself that often. I know that they're rolling out some type of new things occasionally, but it's very not surprising that like, I don't know, really subtle things or like, you know, using like leet speak or stuff like that is like evading these kinds of things. There are certain things that you can do like from a data augmentation, like robustness perspective. But like you kind of have to anticipate like what the alterations are going to be. So yeah, there's some solutions, I guess. But like there's, I don't know, one of my interns at AI2 is working on dog whistles, which are like really, really covert sort of like signals of hate. And like some sub communities have literally just come up with like different new senses of words for referring to minorities so that they would evade like hate speech detection systems. So like people use the word Google to refer to some minority group and they're like, well, Google can't censor the word Google, so we're gonna use the word Google to mean black person or something. And so it's just like if that is what it ends up meaning, then like sure, but then what do? You know? So and there's like no indication that this would be like a bad word in any way.
Three parentheses for Jews.
Yeah, the echo. Yeah.
Was it an echo or was it like a?
It's called
like
an echo.
In a hushed tone. I thought that was the implication.
Well, so it was started out with white supremacists, like anti-Semites, like labeling Jewish people with those symbols, right?
Yeah.
I think it's called the echo because yeah. Cool. Well, thank you.